Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I'm the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker for today. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available, though, by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa History page of YouTube in just a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Andrew Klump is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions before our time runs out. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Sue Burns. Sue Burns is a lifelong Iowan with living roots to a family farm in Polk County. She currently lives in the Des Moines area with her husband. After graduating from Iowa State University, she began a 30-year career in information technology. She traveled the world for work, training employees, documenting processes, and providing technical support. She ended her career there as a business analyst with well-honed skills in data analysis, research, and software testing and implementation. In retirement, she worked part-time for 5 years writing grant proposals for a nonprofit immigration legal services provider in Staten Island, New York. A Common Life is her first book. And now I'm happy to turn over to Sue to begin today's webinar.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm here today to talk about Mary Ann Briggs, and that's not likely to be a familiar name. She was never famous. She didn't rub elbows with those who were. She didn't advance the causes of science or medicine or politics or rights. She was an ordinary woman who lived an ordinary life on an Iowa farm in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What she did do was keep an almost 35-year record of her life in a diary. Mary is my great-great-grandmother. She kept her diary from 1888 until she died in 1922. And I took the words that she wrote and put them in context. Who was this person? What was going on in the world at the time? Why was this important to her? This context, plus a lot of research, became my book, Common Life, A Voice from the Progressive Era. And my slide is not advancing. There it is. Okay. So my book covers the years at the end of her life. She didn't start writing her diary until she was about 45 years old. So how did she become this Iowa farm wife who left an amazing historical resource? Well, Mary was born in 1842 in Crawford County, Ohio, to Asa and Sarah Mosier. She was the ninth of 10 children, all spread across more than 20 years. When Asa Mosier and his family came to Liberty Township in Warren County, Iowa, they were one of the original families to settle there. However, not all of their children made the trip to Iowa with them. They had one daughter, Hannah, who died as a newborn, and one son, Thomas, had died in 1847 as a teenager. At the time of the move, Mary was 11. Her oldest sibling, Stephen Mosier, would have been 27 and already married. He came to Iowa in 1856, just a few years after the rest of the family. His biography in the Warren County History, says that he came to Iowa a poor man and has made all his property since by honesty and hard work. He was also a very active member in the Society of Friends. Mary's next oldest sibling was Jonathan Bunker Mosier, who would have been 25 at the time the family moved. Correspondence between Mary and Jonathan, she called him JB, indicate that he stayed in Ohio and when the family moved to Iowa, and then later he and his family moved to Kansas and settled there. And the rest of their children aren't well documented, so I don't have a lot of information about them. But there's an 1879 history of Warren County that includes a lot of information about the origins of the county and of Liberty Township, where Mary's family settled. This biography of her father that's in that history says that he and the family came to Warren County in 1853, that he owns 160 acres, and he was very involved in township government. Now, since they were one of the original founding families for Liberty Township, what was the township like at that time? So a little bit of history on the area. Um, as of the early 1820s, much of Missouri, which at the time included Iowa, belonged to Sac and Fox peoples. These lands were ceded to the U.S. government in a series of treaties that started in 1824. The final treaty in 1842 called for all of the Sac and Fox to relinquish all of their lands west of the Mississippi and also to move to Kansas by 1846. In 1853, when Mary's family arrived, Iowa had been a state for about 7 years. Warren County had been organized for about 4 years. In 1850, the non-native population of Warren County was less than 1,000. By 1860, it was more than 10,000, and Mary's family was part of that population expansion. Liberty Township itself wasn't organized until after her family arrived, and her father was instrumental in that process. And family lore says that Mary's was one of 6 or 7 families that traveled together from Ohio to Iowa. They were predominantly and maybe totally Quakers who'd had a falling out with their local Quaker group in Ohio, and they were looking for a new start in Iowa. And the first school was built in Liberty Township a few months after Mary's family arrived. The first teacher was a man named John Coles, but Mary's older sister Susan also became a teacher there later. Now, on that previous slide, the Warren County history says that Asa Mosier owned 160 acres in 1879. However, Bureau of Land Management records indicate that within just a few years of arriving in Iowa, he had purchased 760 acres. So when Mary's family moved to Warren County in 1853, they became the 7th family to establish a permanent residence in what would later become Liberty Township. And on that slide we just looked at, almost all of the lands that her father had purchased were in section 21 and 22. There was one purchase that he made in section 15, which is directly north of section 22. And you can see that that schoolhouse that I mentioned earlier is in section 22, right where her father's lands are. Now, and this is also the schoolhouse that I mentioned where her sister Susan was a school teacher. And since Mary was 11 when they came to Liberty, it seems likely that Mary continued her education at her sister's school, at least for a time. Regardless of the education level that she attained, she remained a lifelong reader, writer, and engaged in current events. And all of that started here. Her family was involved with the Society of Friends Church, and even though Mary eventually joined other denominations, the Quaker faith continued to shape much of Mary's later life. Quakers are generally pacifists, and many of the Liberty Township settlers were abolitionists. So when the Civil War started in 1861, a number of Mary's brothers and other relatives fought on the Union side. And her brother Elijah left a written account of his time as a Union soldier in the Mosier family reunion records. Now, while Mary was in Warren County, her future husband's family was also migrating to Iowa. Lemuel Waterman Briggs, or LW, as she referred to him in the diary, was born in Ohio to Lemuel and Mary Ann Waterman Briggs in 1833. He was the third of 5 children. In contrast to Mary's migration story, LW's family didn't come to Iowa as a group. Family lore says that LW, he signed on as a 16-year-old farrier to a Mormon group that was moving west. He would have been 16 in about 1849, which would have been just a couple of years into the Mormon migration west. Lemuel Briggs, LW's father, got a land patent to 240 acres in Dallas County in 1855. In 1860, Lemuel died, and 2 of his sons, LW being one of them, inherited those Dallas County lands. In 1861, LW married his first wife, Mary H. Morgan. In 1863, Mary gave birth to their daughter Viola. This Mary then died about a month after giving birth, and the infant died a month after that. Then LW and Mary Mosier married in 1869. They had 6 children in 8 years, and they farmed the land that was originally LW's father's. So that gets us roughly to the point where the diary and my book start. So let's go back to that time. The year is 1888. Civil War ended almost 20 years ago, and it's been about 40 years since Iowa became a state. It's January 1st, Sunday evening. There are about 2.5 inches of snow on the ground. It's windy, and the temperatures are in the single digits. But if we looked in the window of this Dallas County farmhouse, here's what we might see. A 45-year-old woman sits in a chair near the coal stove of her living room. Her 6 children are asleep in their rooms, and her husband is dozing in another chair. In the quiet of a winter's night, she sharpens a wooden pencil with a penknife. She takes the pencil in her right hand, and the point hovers over a tablet of unlined paper before her. She begins to write. January 1, 1888. I am trying to do all that is necessary to make my home a pleasant place to live in. It is but a common life, but I am trying to raise my children for a life of usefulness and heaven. The business that is mapped out before me is not a small thing. To conduct a school or their lessons, make and laundry the clothing, attend to dairy work, prepare food, and do a great many other things and do them well, and to make the whole business run smoothly. In order to do all this, my brain is taxed to the utmost and makes my life one ceaseless struggle. What would be the result if I should fail before I get them all up to manhood and womanhood? With bowed spirit, I can look back upon opportunities lost with the present around me and the future before me. I move forward with the hope of outriding the storms of life. It is said the load is heavy, but Christ says, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So that is the very first diary entry of Mary Ann Briggs. And with some gaps, she continued to keep a chronicle of her life until just a few months before she died in 1922. Now, the story of how that diary ended up becoming a book is kind of a story in itself. This house that we saw just a few minutes ago, it burned down in April of 1908. And there's a gap in the diary between the fire and when she wrote, May 30, 1908. This is Decoration Day. The last I wrote in this journal was April 11, and on the 12th, I built a fire in the heating stove as it was so cold and I felt the need of a fire. After eating my breakfast, I sat down to write some letters. I think I had written one and a card. I was warm and thought I should not need any more heat that day. I got up, opened the door, and discovered the house was on fire, all in the attic and roof. It was under such headway that it burned down, and I could not get much out. This was terrible to see my house and all in it consumed. The insurance company paid me $1,000, but don't bring back my household goods. Now, with so many of her belongings destroyed in this fire, I've always wondered, where was the diary? Was it one of the things that she treasured enough to get out before everything was gone? Or did she keep the diary someplace else? Now, if you look closely, you can see there's a small building that's not attached to her house. And this is what she called her summer kitchen. So I always wondered if maybe she sat in this kitchen to write in her diary, and that's where she kept it, and that's why it survived the fire. But she never says. One thing she did say in her diary was that she wrote about when this photograph was taken, and it was just a couple of years before the fire. And that's Mary standing in her front yard behind her rocking chair. So the diary pages, like this one, survived the fire that destroyed her house, and she continued to write in it throughout the rest of her life. When she died, she didn't have a will. So I was able to find probate records that listed all of her personal possessions at the time of her death. There were also documents indicating that a couple of neighbor women had been charged with assigning values to all of those items. And then there were court documents that detailed the distribution of all those items. So which of her 6 children got which items. But nowhere in any of those lists was the diary mentioned. But somebody got it. So the diary pages then sat in some attic, maybe more than one, until the mid 1990s. And when I first heard about the diary, it was because I went to visit my parents, and my mom was telling me about this project that she was working on, transcribing this diary with her electric typewriter. And the problem was that as soon as the diary had been removed from the attic where it had been stored, all of the pages started to disintegrate. And she was really, really concerned that the words that Mary wrote not be lost, and she was trying to do something about that. So I offered to help her with that, and we spent a lot of time getting the diary text, digitized into an electronic form. And then I mostly did the organization and formatting of it while Mom looked for photos and other things to illustrate things that Mary wrote in her diary. For example, in one diary entry, Mary wrote, December 16, 1921. I went to Dallas Center with Claude and Mabel, and they had a picture taken of 4 generations, taken of Fanny and I and Mabel and baby a few days ago. Well, my mom found that photograph. So that's Mary seated at the left. Her daughter Fanny is standing behind, and Fanny's daughter Mabel is holding baby Mildred. And the Claude that was mentioned is Mabel's husband. So this photograph was taken just about 6 months before she died. So if it's not the last photograph ever taken of her, it's certainly one of them. So when Mom and I thought we'd gotten that diary as final as we could get it, Mom printed up a bunch of copies of the diary and hosted an honoring Mary party in 1999. And she invited all of Mary's descendants that she could find and gave everyone who attended a copy of that diary. And then nothing more happened with the diary until about 2017. And that's when I donated a copy of that diary to the Iowa Women's Archive in Iowa City, which is an organization that collects diaries and journals of Iowa women. And the curators there were really excited about this diary because they didn't have anything in their collection that went back to 1888. And the other reason that they were really excited about it is that from their experience, most of the diaries and journals had very short entries, things like colder today or it rained last night. But as you can tell from some of the diary entries that I've already read, Mary really wrote things. And they were really excited about how that could possibly be a real resource for people interested in that period of history. Well, in talking to them, I kind of got really excited about trying to find out as much as I could about the stories behind what Mary wrote, what was going on in the world at the time and how did it all fit together. So I started researching things that Mary wrote in her diary. I tried to corroborate events, identify people, put things in context. For example, when she wrote that Newton Stanley had stopped by for a visit and they talked for an hour, I wondered who was Newton Stanley and why was this conversation important to her? When she wrote about going to the train station and people were saying that Adele is burning, I wanted to know what caused the fire. Were people hurt? How much damage was done? And how did they fight a fire like that back then? In 1903, Wright brothers' first flight happened, but she didn't write about that. That was in a gap in the diary. There were several years during that time period where she didn't write any journal entries. They also corresponded to the period of time where her husband was dying. So there's a gap, and then the first entry after that gap is she's writing about the death of her husband. So she didn't write about the Wright brothers' first flight, but only 8 years later, she did write about going to Hyperion Clubhouse to see the flying machines. And I wondered, what was that like? I looked in newspapers and they said that that was an Iowa first, 3 planes in the sky at the same time, and she was there for that. And I mentioned earlier that she lived through the Civil War. So when World War I started, she had memories of that previous war in her head. And she wrote quite a lot about her personal experiences of World War I. And I always wondered, how did people respond to that? How to the United States entering the war. And how did she feel about Camp Dodge and the soldiers that were very close to her house? And the soldiers would sometimes come and have lunch in her orchard. She also lived through the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919, and she wrote about that as well as other diseases like smallpox, scarlet fever, pneumonia. And I wondered, this is a time before antibiotics. How were these diseases diagnosed and treated? And many of these were diseases that, I don't even have to think about anymore. Another thing that I really enjoyed in reading her diary was her use of language. Now, for the most part, the language that Mary used was very much the English that any of us 100 years later would understand, but not exactly. Language isn't a static thing, of course, and it did shift some over the last century. I mean, there were a number of times where she would use a word or a phrase, and of course, it's words I know, but she was clearly using them in a way that seemed unfamiliar to me. For example, she wrote about taking the train to Des Moines to do some shopping where she bought a black silk waist. And I didn't know what that meant. It seemed to be an article of clothing, both because it's made of silk and because she mentioned it in with some other clothes that she'd purchased. But I didn't know what kind of clothing. I combed through a lot of newspapers from that year, and I found a lot of ads that were advertising wastes made of made of different materials. But it was apparently so common a thing that it took a while for me to find an ad that had an illustration. And the way that she used waist, which is short for shirtwaist, was they called a blouse back then. And another example is one particularly wet spring. She wrote about the abysmal state of the dirt road in front of her house, what is now Highway 44 between Grimes and Dallas Center. She said that the road had just begun to get dry enough so that some vehicles could get through, but most were fast in the road. And at first, that seemed really strange given the quagmire conditions. I mean, how could any vehicle be going fast? But then I realized she didn't mean that they were going fast. She meant that they were stuck fast or fastened to the road. And another thing that's ripe for terminology changing is the common names of plants and animals. And Mary was a big fan of the natural world in general and flowers in particular. And one spring, she wrote about the boys and girls blooming. And I didn't know that what that was. I assumed it was a flower, but I did find a late 19th century wildflower book that listed boys and girls, and it also had an illustration of that. And from that, I understood that what she called boys and girls is what I would call Dutchman's breeches. So obviously, a lot of research done. Um, some of the sources that I used for research, public records. A lot of the information in my book came from public records. I mean, it was lucky for me that Mary's farm is in Dallas County because almost all of the historical public records were available online. And I was able to track the ownership of her farm from the original land patent that her father-in-law got in 1855 until that land left her family in 1926. It's also how I got the probate records. Some subscriptions to online archives like ancestry.com provided a lot of birth, death, marriage certificates, as well as census data. And some organizations that existed in Mary's time still exist, and I was able to find some pieces of data from their records. And there are a number of archival records of publications, books, newspapers, magazines, and those really helped a lot. When Mary would write about a book she was reading or a magazine she subscribed to or a gardening or shopping catalog that she'd purchased something from, in some cases, I could find the exact edition or issue of what she was talking about. And newspapers.com was also really helpful for discovering more details about things that she mentioned. Like, for example, when a cyclone hit her farm, it destroyed some of her outbuildings and moved her barn off of its foundation. And she wrote a lot about rebuilding and working with the insurance company, but it was the newspaper reports that gave me more information about the scope and strength of the storm and the extent of the damage outside of her farm. And also, because Mary was my great great grandmother, I was able to have some conversations with family members. For example, Mary died before my dad was born, but he personally remembers all of her children. And through conversations with him and his cousins, I learned a lot more about the people that her children became. The Mosier family has also held family reunions almost every year since 1921. They had meeting minutes and photos, memories and histories written by family members over the years. In 1921, at the very first Mosier reunion, Mary was 78, and the reunion was attended by all of her children and many of her grand and great grandchildren. Her life and history was the focus of that first reunion, and it was recorded in the minutes. This is also where I got her brother's account of his Civil War experiences. So I took her firsthand account of living in the progressive era and all that research, which resulted in my book, Common Life, A Voice from the Progressive Era. And it was published in September of 2022, 100 years after her death. Now, about the book, because she wrote so often of very similar things, I didn't want to organize the book chronologically. She managed a farm, so there were a lot of entries about the weather or the harvest, and it didn't make sense to me to keep repeating similar sorts of entries throughout the book. So I decided to organize the book around various themes that she consistently wrote about. Instead of a year by year chronicle of all events, I looked at the individual themes across the entire scope of the diary. For example, she was a big reader and would frequently write about things that she'd been reading. And I really liked being able to look at just her reading habits across the entire diary. This approach allowed me to find patterns and sometimes see connections that wouldn't have jumped out at me if I'd been focused on all of the information chronologically. So, this is the table of contents, and it shows those themes that I pulled from her writing. And you've already heard just a little bit about how the diary became the book. Well, it has its own chapter in the book. So each chapter is focused on one of these themes, and within that chapter, the information is chronological. What that means is there isn't one story arc that goes across the entire book. And for the most part, you can read these chapters in any order you want to. Now, to give you a little bit of flavor of what the book itself is like, I thought I would read some excerpts. This next one is a passage from the Getting Around chapter about a visit she made to her youngest daughter, Lily. Visiting Lily. With Lily's wedding in 1906, she and her new husband took trains to their future home in South Dakota. This led to Mary making her first extensive train trip to visit Lily in her new home. August 1, 1907. I went to Des Moines, then to Highland Park, then back to the Union Station and waited until 1:30, then boarded the train to Madrid. Waited until about 4, then got on and went through Perry about daylight, then on to Manila and changed cars, then on and through a portion of Iowa that I had never seen and thought it interesting. Then changed cars and got a new ticket at Sioux City, then on to Mitchell. Changed cars, then on to Chamberlain. Had to go to a hotel and stay all night, then go to Presho. The next morning, Lily was there to meet me, made a 2 weeks visit, and came home. Based on train schedules published 1907 to 1908, Grimes to Des Moines took roughly 25 minutes. She arrived around 1 a.m. She waited until 1:30 a.m. to leave for Madrid. Des Moines to Madrid was an hour and 25 minutes travel time. Then she had about an hour's wait until 4 a.m. for her next train. The Madrid to Sioux City trip took about 6 hours, with a 20-minute layover in Manila. Sioux City to Mitchell took 5 hours and 25 minutes. Mitchell to Chamberlain, where she spent the night, was another 2 hours and 45 minutes. The following day, the train to Presho took an hour and 50 minutes. All of that makes about 18 hours of train time plus the overnight in Chamberlain and waits between trains and stations. So approximately 30 hours of total travel time to cover 484 miles. I know all the details of that trip because I found the train schedules and this railroad map in a private railroad memorabilia collection. And I've highlighted the route on the map that she took as well as all of the towns that she mentioned. Now, she did take one other long train trip. That one was in 1913 to visit her son, brother, and other relatives in Kansas. She didn't detail the train route quite as precisely as she did for this South Dakota trip, but she did write about being away from home for about 3.5 months. And that was the last time she took a big train trip. In 1913, she would have been 70 or 71. And she just wrote that travel was such an ordeal for her that she just couldn't do it anymore. It just took her too long to recover. Now, as much information as I was able to find, like the train schedules and map, there were still so many things that I could never find out. The mysteries chapter addresses some of those, and the following is from that chapter. Little mysteries. There are so many things in the diary that will forever remain a mystery. References to events or people that aren't explained, comments that made perfect sense to her, but little or no sense now. Ambiguous wording with little context to know how she meant it. I think of these as the little mysteries. May King and her horse. May 1921. May King brought her horse and buggy and other things here. I guess I shall have to do something. I did not know where it was going to lead me. May, May 22, 1921. We can think as we want to. May King went to Des Moines yesterday, but left her horse and boxes of things. There is somebody to be helped all of the time. Maybe we need help sometime ourselves. Written a few days apart, are these entries related? What things did May bring and then leave at Mary's house? Why does she leave her horse and buggy for Mary to take care of while she goes to Des Moines? Does Mary think that May is a do-gooder, helping others, when Mary thinks that she herself needs help? Or does she think May is inconsiderate, using and abusing her hospitality by presuming she will provide lodging for the night and stable a horse at a moment's notice? It seems likely that May dropped off her horse and buggy, and Mary didn't know what she was getting into or that she would be in charge of them for so long. May and Lily were probably friends. In 1905, before Lily married Roy, May came to spend the night before the two young women went to Des Moines together the next day. In 1907, May made the trip to South Dakota to visit her brother and Lily. She invited Mary to travel with her. Mary declined. She also came to visit Mary and Lily in 1920 and spent the night. So May has history with Mary's family. In this case, perhaps familiarity breeds contempt because the following entry is probably the least circumspect comment in the entire diary. There is certainly no ambiguity about what she thinks of May King here. December 6, 1921. May King came and stayed 2 nights and days. I do not like her very well. I love this passage because Mary generally went to pretty good lengths to be circumspect in her diary. For example, there's one entry where she wrote that someone had told her a secret, but if she wrote it in her diary, it would be the same as telling it, so she didn't. So for her to come right out and say, I do not like her very well, that tells me there's a whole story in those few words. However, what it is going to remain a mystery. So now in a moment, I'm going to be taking some questions. But for those of you who would like to read more about Mary's life in the late 19th and early 20th century, here are some ways that you can get the book. You can buy a copy on Amazon. It's available in both print and ebook formats. Some of the local libraries have a copy on their shelves, and also Beaverdale Books has some signed copies that they have for sale. So that's it for me, and I think now we move on to questions.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Sue. That was fascinating. We do have plenty of time for questions. As a reminder, if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature in Zoom. That's at the bottom of your Zoom box. So please drop those in and we will get to them. Please note, we may not get to all our questions, but we do have plenty of time. So if you've got a question, throw it in there. Our first question that we have come is, how do you balance family lore with some of the evidence that you're finding in sources? So how do you I think the question there is, how do you balance maybe the oral histories that have more details or extra details with some of the things that you're able to find? Did you ever find that they didn't align maybe even?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously that can go both ways. I did have some conversations with family that were quite instrumental in me figuring out some things. So in those cases, while the lore wasn't very detailed, it did kind of point me in the right direction. And in that case, I could corroborate what was part of the family lore with some actual documents and documentation. But sometimes, yeah, I mean, if it's family lore and I find nothing to document it, it's like, well, okay, this is a story, take it for what it's worth.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think you did a nice job in the presentation of of even signaling to us today what was lore and what was stuff that you were finding elsewhere. And I just think that's an interesting balance
Yeah,
that you
that
kind
was
of
very
explore.
conscious in writing the book as
Hmm.
well, because I decided fairly early on that I was not going to novelize the
Hmm.
story from her diary. Basically, if I put it in the book, it's because I found some sort of documentation that corroborates it.
Hmm.
If it was something that I couldn't corroborate for whatever reason, then I would say things like, this could be possibly,
Hmm.
maybe, I think, to qualify it that that was not something that I had documentation for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very interesting and well done there, I think. Another question we have come in is, says that this individual's relatives also migrated from Ohio through Illinois and then to Iowa. Do you know where in Ohio Mary's family departed from?
I do have that information. I'm not coming up with it off the top of my head. I think it was Crawford County, but that might have been one of those counties that got renamed somewhere along the way because I know that happened. No, that was Morrow County.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I have that information. I just don't have it off the top of my head right now.
Hmm. Um, this question asks, what was the scope of her diary? And by that, I mean, was she focused? Did you find that she focused a little bit more on her interior life or more on commenting on what was going on around her? Just what was the balance, I think, is what this question's asking. Because it
That
sounds like
is
she does a
very
little bit of both.
interesting. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't think I ever got to the point of trying to categorize entries to see what was more. I think it was pretty balanced. She did
Mhm.
talk a lot about her loneliness, especially after her husband died, um, and how she felt about certain things. She also wrote about things that she was reading in the newspaper and magazines, so things that were
Mhm.
going on in the world. And she talked a lot about like her neighbors, her family, people she into at the train station, or just random interactions that she had with people. So I would say it was probably pretty well balanced, but
Mhm.
maybe a little bit more on the, nuts and bolts of daily life and what was going on in the world. So maybe slightly less on in her
Mhm.
interior life.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. That's great. Um, Another question that came in says it was so interesting to see she wrote about her mental health. It was probably something that wasn't talked about back then. Could you comment on her mental and physical health and how she documents those?
That is a very interesting question. And in fact, I put chapters in the book on health and medicine, and in that I do include her mental health. Um, I personally think that she probably had some depression going on, especially after her husband died. She really, really missed him. Um, and of course, at that time, you didn't get mental health care unless you ended up in an insane asylum or something. If she talks to anybody about her mental struggles, she doesn't mention that. She does write that she can talk to her journal as if it were a friend. And so she does put some of that stuff in her diary. But yeah, there really didn't seem to be much in the way of, awareness of mental health issues and treating mental health issues.
Thank you. Yeah. This next question says, could you talk a little bit more about how she was responding and thinking about World War One? I know you mentioned she talked quite a bit about that, but what was she thinking, talking about, feeling?
One of the big things was the Liberty Bonds. She wrote about, and this is kind of an interesting thing to observe throughout the course of the war, because at the beginning, people bought Liberty Bonds to support the war effort, to do their part at home, to support the troops and that sort of thing. And then later on in the war, she writes about, being charged so much per time period that she had to pay for the war effort. And it's like that mental shift from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. In the beginning, everybody's in this together, everybody's doing their part and buying their Liberty bonds. And then by the end of it, she was talking about, I've got to buy this Liberty bond and I'm never going to see the benefit of it, because by then she was, in her late 70s and she wasn't expecting to get the return on that. And she ended up not, because she died in 1922 before some of that had paid out. There was another entry where she talked about, um, actually, there were a lot of entries, being unable to get help. She had like a fence that needed to be fixed. And again, she was in her 70s at the time, so that's not work she could do herself. But all of the able-bodied men had been, sent off to war, and everybody else has been trying to fill in the manufacturing jobs. And she couldn't get somebody to come out and help repair her fence. So the labor pool had changed, and she talked about that. And she also had this one entry, and she was talking about um, rationing and, things that were very expensive now, or things that they just, couldn't even get. And she had this one line where she said something about, we can't buy bread, but somewhere they're making whiskey. Yeah. And so I just thought that was very interesting, because Iowa had prohibition before the country had prohibition. So there was prohibition in Iowa, and she was, railing about how they were making alcohol with grains instead of bread. So yeah, she had some opinions about that.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating, and to hear how her opinions are situated in her exact context. Like it wasn't just talking about battles, but war bonds and prohibition. It's super interesting.
Yes.
Um, This next question, full disclosure, is from me. I'm wondering how you decided where to get started and do your research. Did you just move through time, entry by entry, or did you kind of follow themes and ideas, learning a lot about insurance and all the places that went, and then disasters or something like that? I know you organized by theme, but as you were providing context to those different entries as you moved through the diary, how'd you go about knowing how to start and dig in?
Well, mostly you just jump in and start someplace. The themes thing didn't come out or come about until much later in the book writing process. Where I started was kind of like you said, just start at the beginning, read this entry, and it's like, okay, what can I find out about this? Depending on what the entry was, it's like, okay, can I find any corroborating information? you know, can I find anything anyplace else? And who is this person? And I started just entry by entry, seeing what information I could find. And then as it got to the end of that process, and I basically researched everything I thought I could find, that's when I started thinking about, okay, now how am I going to organize this book? How am I going to put this all together so that it's coherent somehow? And then that's how I ended up deciding on what those themes would be, and then pulling those entries that related to the themes and then writing the narration that goes around the diary entries that puts them in context.
But I'm always interested in how people go about doing their work, how you get from one place to the other. So that's super interesting to hear. The next question I've got here says, how long was the diary? So how many pages is what we're getting at, how long was this thing?
That I don't know. Part of the issue was that, okay, yeah, she wrote on this really cheap newsprint tablet paper. And so the diary pages, when they were found, some of the pages were loose. They weren't necessarily in the right order. So part of putting the first digitized version of the diary together was just trying to figure out what order the pages come in. Because she tended to put the month only on the first of the month and then just numbers for the days within the month. And she only put the year on like January 1st. So we had all of these pages, and it was a real puzzle trying to figure out, okay, does this page come after this page? Or, is this in a different year, or does it even belong in this year? And I don't, we never did an actual count of how many pages there were. Um, I think the diary itself, after we digitized it, of course, I printed it off like single spaced. There's probably 100 pages there, but it was a lot more in diary pages because her handwriting would have been bigger. She didn't get that much text per page. But I don't have an actual number of how
Mhm.
many pages there were. There were a lot of them.
Yeah, interesting. And how interesting to think, like what was a really clear convention for her for dating and uh could be such a puzzle.
Well, if the
Super.
pages had stayed together in the
Yeah,
right order, it
yeah,
wouldn't have been as big a problem.
yeah. But all of a sudden you find a very different, you're having to piece it together. That's fascinating.
Well,
Um,
and one of the things that happened was the the diary version that my mom and I put together. When I went back to that and started doing the research and digging into things to writing the book, I came across spots like, oh, well, that's clearly not in the right place. That belongs over here. And so, I figured out that some of the organization that mom and I had done back in the 90s, we'd gotten it wrong, because
mhm,
by the time you dig in and really try to figure out what this is talking about, it's like it's clear that it doesn't go here, it goes over here.
mhm. Absolutely. Uh, so our next question says, you mentioned little mysteries. Were there any larger or bigger mysteries that you just couldn't sort out or figure out?
Yes. Yeah, the mysteries chapter has little mysteries, medium mysteries, and the royal mystery. And the royal mystery is like the big kahuna that I wish I could figure out, and I didn't. So yes, there were all different kinds of mysteries because there was just so much that I couldn't figure out. I mean, the things that I could figure out, sometimes I was just absolutely amazed. But yeah, there's other things, especially the really personal stuff, like the royal mystery that I mentioned. Apparently, there was some sort of a rift in the family with the one son and the rest of the family.
Mm,
And she had an entry once that said, I just wish we could all be happy in family reunion or something like that. But she never said what the problem was. And I don't think it went to the level of estrangement, but there was some sort of a distancing there. And it's like, I really wish I knew what that was because it really affected a lot of other things that she wrote about in her diary.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. And there's probably no way to ever find out, some of those really personal things. It's truly a
Exactly,
royal
because this is
mystery.
so personal. It's like it's not going to be in newspapers. It's
Hmm.
not going to be, any place that I mean, if I could find somebody maybe who was a descendant of that son who happened to know the family lore that says, oh, well, that's what this was about, but I haven't found that person, so I
Hmm.
I don't know what that might be.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. So I've got one more question here for you
Okay.
before we wrap up, and which is, I think, a really nice question to end with, which is, do you know why she wrote her diary? Did she have a sense that she was writing something for history? You mentioned that she didn't want to write down secrets because that would be akin to giving it up, but you also mentioned that it was her friend. So did she have a sense of what she was doing as historically leaving a record, or was it mostly just for her benefit, a little bit of both? Um,
And I think that changed over the course of the diary. And there's a section in the book where I talk about that because, yeah, at the beginning of the diary, it's a lot of, she says, dear old friend, and then she starts her diary entry, or I can talk to you as I would a friend. But then somewhere about, I want to say 1906, 1907, she starts talking about it more as a record of her life. And there is one diary entry, and this comes from April 7th, 1907. She wrote, I hope what I have written down on the pages of this journal will be of interest to those who may read them after the hand that has penned them has ceased its labors. So she did have some concept of, yeah, maybe somebody's going to see this someday. But I think there was kind of an evolution over the course of the diary about how she thought about her diary.
Interesting. Well, and maybe that makes sense too, right? She starts off with this this diary that she's using to express thoughts, and then eventually she's done it for 30 years and realizes maybe the scope of what she's done. It's pretty incredible. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think for me, and I don't know this is just speculation on my part, but about that time, she read a book that was written in the form of a diary, and it was um, started with a girl who was 16, and then it carries on through her life, getting married and having children and stuff like that. And it's about that time when her attitude towards her diary seems to change. So I'm wondering if reading that book kind of changed something in her mind about what her diary could be like.
hmm yeah.
Like I said, I don't know. That's just speculation on my part, but the timing is very suggestive. And
Hmm.
that was about the time that she wrote that entry that I just read.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it makes sense to me, but we probably never know for sure. But that's fascinating, and really interesting. So thank you.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're
and
welcome.
yeah, and with that answer, we'll bring our webinar to a close today. I want to thank you to everybody who joined us today, and really want to thank you again to Sue for being such a great presenter and walking us through this fascinating history. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information or to register for future webinars in this series or watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. And if you're looking to learn more Iowa history, you can find and watch over 115 webinars from the past 101 History 101 programs on the Iowa History YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you virtually for our next special Iowa History 101 webinar on July 10th. The topic will be the Hollander Fires and the Black Hand, a clash of cultures. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon, everyone.